This is a personal reflection on art and faith in the midst of ill health. During this paper, I will also be using some direct quotes from the original thesis that this talk builds on. In 2012, I completed a graduate certificate in research methodology to develop my coursework masters. At the time, I was the lecturer in art at Tabor in Victoria, and continuing study was expected. At that time, I had recently attended and had been on the leadership team for a small church plant, and for my research I did an autoethnographical essay titled Imagination, Myth and Eucharist, exploring my experience of having the chronic condition fibromyalgia since 2005. In my essay, I explored how the experience of weekly communion had become a touchstone for theologically addressing and, just as importantly, physically grappling with the day-to-day of that experience. I wrote about having to come to terms with a body that seemed to be broken and could not be fixed, with the tension of what it also means to be a child of God, made in the image of God. I felt that I had been seeking and listening to God, and now those plans were not going to happen the way that I had anticipated, and I needed to reassess how I viewed God and life. Part of my premise was that our engagement with imagination was not only acceptable, but an essential way of engaging with God. In my late teens, through the influence of my Christian parents, many books, and then as I went on to my initial training in the theatre, I discovered to my joy that my relatively natural inclusion of imagination in faith could be helpful, despite its relative absence in my experience of a fairly traditional mainstream Protestant churches up until then. As I wrote in the essay, the imagination is a faculty that we all have that facilitates how we engage with revelation. The imagination is not how we create God or make up the experience of transcendence. It is not itself transcendent. It is because we have imagination that it becomes a way in which we are able to connect with the experience of God. I explored how, through our imagination, we are then able to engage with the myth by which we, consciously or subconsciously, live our lives. I defined myth not by the common usage of falsehood, but as a foundational creation story that tells us about the world and helps us make sense of it. A myth is a story that guides how we live and provides a pattern of behaviour that we can bind our lives to. It also invites us to become a part of the story it tells. The pattern and story of the life of God is one of passion, death, resurrection, or, as it is sometimes understood, creation, fall, redemption, but I used the former wording. Firstly, there is the giving of oneself in creation, for example, the creation of the world, or Jesus willingly going to Jerusalem despite the pain he knew this would bring him. In death or in the fall there is suffering. God does not prevent death or suffering, but neither does God punish us through them. We discover then that it is on the other side of death or suffering that God offers us a way of resurrection or redemption. Prior to the experience of chronic ill health, however, and quite unsurprisingly, I believed in God's story, but was more closely living the common myth of our society, that it is through our productivity and usefulness that we create our value as people, rather than our value being found in the gift from God of being created in the image of God. It wasn't intentional, and it wasn't the story I wanted to live my life by, but it is very often the story we are encouraged to live. I did then, and unfortunately still do, fall back into this trap all too easily, believing one foundational story while living out the story of a completely different one. In my essay, I reflected on my experience of the previous 8 years. I came to realise that it was through the experience of attending a church plant who participated in weekly communion that I had the opportunity, over time, to realise the call to God's story. It was the living ritual, the sacrament of the Eucharist, played out week after week, that invited me into a metaphorical, a physical, and a spiritual space to come to God as we are, and find God within that space. In this space, we invite God to move as He wishes, not as we expect. I feel I had the opportunity for this realization because of our way of gathering, and it was one that I needed at the time. Each week we would gather for our service, and mostly at the end of the service, we would each take an actual cup and a chunk of bread and spend time in reflection and prayer, both personally and together, and it provided an opportunity and experience that I so deeply needed. While I believe any number of ways of engaging in communion is and can be significant, this opportunity of time and the sensory nature allowed me the time, the space, and the physicality to find stillness and rest. It was not a magical cure, but rather became a regular place of resting within my tiredness and pain in the history, knowledge, communion of this ritual as it was transformed into a sacrament. During this time, I was able to slowly turn from the worldly view of worth through actions, and instead was beginning to allow myself to recognise how intimately God understands pain and suffering. It's not that I hadn't previously been aware of God's suffering. Rather, it was the gradual realisation that the privilege of having the Holy Spirit within us, within me, meant that Jesus' experience of pain extended to my own. To live within me must be to share in my pain. That Jesus shared in my pain, not just metaphorically but physically and spiritually, day in and day out, was both a relief and an encouragement. I began to reintegrate a compartmentalised faith. My physical pain forced me to combine head, soul, spirit with body. Pain affects faith, and faith affects pain. I needed to come to God with my pain, uncertainty, confusion, and questions, even if there was no definite or quick answer. It has been interesting to reflect recently on the original essay again, as it was written at a time when I hoped I would never again have to experience the same depths of ill health that I had initially. While I knew I wasn't cured then, I also thought I could manage it and to live quite normally within it. At the time I was teaching, coordinating, studying, and my life was beginning again. But within 12 months of completing the graduate certificate, I had to resign from a job I had loved more than any other, and once again was completely and utterly unable to live life normally. This time around, the fibromyalgia was less particular. In the first period of ill health, it began as a sharp pain in specific places as it travelled around my body. It began like tennis elbow, but simultaneously in both, and spread to my wrists, my neck, my back, my hips, and down to my knees. This time it was more of a constant, all-over body pain, with an increase of specific pain occurring if I engaged in any type of repetitive activity. But the daily experience was more like a heavy, wet, woolen blanket had permanently attached itself to my skin, weighing me down and forcing me to live as though I was pushing through sludge. Repetition made things worse, so life became a constant balance of sitting, standing, lying, walking, doing, but mostly not doing. A thick grey fog had wrapped itself around my brain, so the world was grey, foggy and distant. I was always tired but hardly slept. I was in pain and my body reacted like it was injured, but there was nothing wrong, again. During the initial wave of ill health, I had begun playing with paper collage, experimenting and making jewellery because it was a way to de-stress and to do something pleasant without pressure or expectation. I began slowly reading about and incorporating creativity, both my own and a reflection on others, into my spiritual practice. Something I found very helpful as it developed this process of actively searching for God within my imagination. In my initial master's study, I chose to focus on art and spirituality. I then included as much of this as I possibly could into my teaching, encouraging those in my classes to explore and develop their own practices, artistic and spiritual, in whatever form of creativity they engaged in. Although I had been teaching subjects like art and spirituality, art and history, appreciation, drama, I had never thought of myself as a visual artist before the second wave of ill health. I hadn't quite taken on board what I included in my classes of embracing the term artist, or of allowing art to be something unexpected. I had been willing for others to make unexpected art, but not yet for myself. My own visual art is non-traditional, conceptual, abstract, random, product of things I could easily pick up and experiment with at home. And it was untrained. It was feelings and experience. While I shared the overall experience of being involved in creativity at church, and while teaching and encouraging others into the practice of creative spirituality, I rarely shared what I was making, except for the jewellery. But after teaching, I made the decision that given my ill health and the need to reassess life again, in the meantime, I was going to start to share my art. After the initial 12 months of complete collapse where I was pretty much, once again, a recluse, I began exploring how to bring to life pieces that in some way expressed an experience I could barely find words for. While my creative and artistic ability developed, the improvement of my health was slow. I thought I should know what I was doing. I'd been through this before, but it wasn't the same. I was more tired, more overwhelmed, and less positive. It had been going on so long, I felt I had fewer options, I had less youth, I had fewer social connections, and I had lost the initial optimism that I would get over this, because my experience said otherwise. My need for times of creativity grew. It was the only place of rest, physically and mentally. It was a way of focusing on something other than the pain. It was undemanding, restful, meditative, peaceful, and yet offered challenges when I had the focus to follow them. And it was only in the willingness to just sit within whatever I was feeling and slowly and quietly make whatever I was making that I could even glimpse God. I no longer attended the church plant, and the new church didn't quite offer a similar restful space to be in, and so, quite naturally, some of the experience of the Eucharist began to be incorporated into the act of making things. Much of my work was and continues to be about repetition, taking time, making new out of old, and about engaging in the creative as a spiritual practice. In this space, it does not matter how long it takes me to complete a piece, or even if it is completed at all. It does not matter if I am in the physical position to get up, to do housework, to go out, to see people. I work at a pace I can manage. In this space, I am able to realise that it does not matter if I do not produce a finished piece, but rather I can enjoy my slow creativity, relax my body, and especially still and focus my mind and focus on God, sit within this space, make and produce nothing. In the fibro fog, not only does the world become grey, but my ability for words is diminished. I made a lot of pieces about feeling as though I'd lost my words. Teaching and study require so many words, and it felt like they took up my daily quota, and I wondered if I had lost my words forever. At other times, though, the space of creativity became challenging, physically demanding, and sometimes quite painful. I had to plan these pieces because they were not restful. I had to plan to rest in preparation and then in recovery, always at the expense of being able to do other things. But it felt like through this experience of deliberately using my body, even with my pain, I was able to process what I was experiencing. The pain of creating, especially the plaster pieces, was symbolic and ritualistic. I was using my own body, my hands. I was physically, painfully putting myself into the work and then inviting others to be involved in that experience. It was through the act of creativity that my body slowly became something that I could begin to accept again. It often feels like my body has betrayed me, that it is a stranger to me, that it has let me down from the promise of youth. But actually it is still a body. I am still a body, a whole person who is God's. And God doesn't expect us to achieve anything in particular to be His children. For me, the creative act is a mystery. By doing the unproductive act of creativity, I am reminded that I am a being. In creating, I find a rest and an invitation to be. That which rejects society's ideas about doing, about productivity, and about success. These imperfect creations remind me again and again that God does not see us for what we do. I am reminded of God's redemption. In the process of making something new out of something old, of collaging together torn up pieces, when accepting and incorporating a mistake, when creating simply for creation's sake or as a way of focusing or praying, when using scraps that otherwise would be thrown out, I am reminded that God does not discard us when we do not appear to be like everybody else. That the old, the broken, the discarded, the not quite right, the torn, the frayed edges, the random, the rough, are still valuable, can still be redeemed, can be interesting, can be beautiful. The experience of the Eucharist is a slow, unhurried process. It is tangible and engages the senses. It was a ritual that became a sacrament, and one that emphasised to me the importance of slowing down, of taking time, of listening, of being unproductive. This is a process we must go through as we learn and remember and relearn how to listen to God and ourselves, to go from trying to quiet the voices in our head to appreciating the peace, to offer moments of listening and being listened to feel the weight of a full cup, the softness or chewiness or crispness of the bread, to smell the aroma of other people's work of creation, to realise that Jesus gave us a real, live, physical meal to remember Him by, and He calls us to do this as often as we remember Him. While they are not the same, what creativity and the Eucharist offer us can be similar in that both can turn me towards God. Either could become a dead ritual rather than a living one. They are experiences we are invited to participate in, but we are not forced to. Both are a mystery we are invited to enter, an experience that cannot simply be recreated time and time again. In reflection, in moments of quiet, in creativity and in participating in the Eucharist, I am reminded that beauty can be found in the most unusual of places if only we will look. That beauty is different, broader and deeper than we often think or than what society tells us it is, but also that we must be willing to look for it in order to see it. That brokenness doesn't mean that there is no redemption or that redemption isn't possible, and that if we fail to allow ourselves to look for beauty, we will fail to see God. In the process of creativity, God is willing to touch me, sometimes it seems only ever so lightly, and offer my body and mind space from the world and peace within it, and a glimpse of God's self. Neither are magic tricks with prescribed or guaranteed outcomes, but rather are opportunities for engagement, opportunities for openness and for connection. Who I am is more important to God than what I do, something I need to be reminded of again and again as I search for how to live independently within the body I have been given and the limits I may always have within this world. And while I search for how to do this, some grace and peace can be found in creativity, and a moment of both personal and corporate grace and peace can be felt within the ritual that becomes the sacrament of participating in the Eucharist with others, knowing we come to a God who accepts us as we are, while inviting us to live ever more and more like Him.